Hello, welcome this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Pablo de Jesus. I'm the Executive Director of the Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice, headquartered in Washington, D.C. I'm sure that many of you know us. I'd like to ask you to do the typical sort of UU Zoom roll call and place into the chat your name, your congregation, your state. Add any preferred pronouns and a land acknowledgement if you like. This is so that our two guests this evening have a solid sense of who's in the room with them. I'm also going to ask you to mind your microphones, place yourself on mute. We don't want the hosts to have to mute you. The controls are usually an icon within your Zoom interface. They most often look like a stylized microphone or a stylized video camera. If you're attending via smartphone, you may have to swipe around to find similar controls, and I encourage you to do that now. In general, we ask that you treat each other with the same kindness that you wish to receive. We can have differences of opinion without being snippy. Please try to stick to questions over statements. Use I statements over you statements and we statements over they statements when we get to the question and answer period. Our guidelines for attendance and participation this evening is, this session is off the record and closed to the press. If you are a press member and want comments from UUSJ or our guests, we direct you to their corresponding websites for the appropriate means of contact. Audio and video recording, copying of slides, and use of AI note-taking tools are prohibited this evening. In general, you shouldn't do that without the written consent from your hosts, and this evening, UUSJ and our hosts are withholding that. Please be kind to each other. And please be kind to UUSJ. Respect our C3 status. We are a political organization and we engage in policy matters, but we are non-partisan. UUSJ is about issues. We're motivated by the idea that multiple oppressions are intertwined and that people must work together to end them. We champion our UU values of love, interdependence, pluralism, justice, transformation, generosity, and equity. And so we invite you this evening to join us in that spirit. Please buy Professor Han's book. It's a great read. And look for links in the chat or our UUSJ emails or online at Penguin House. And while you're doing that, please consider a donation to UUSJ. The work ahead of us is significant. Our agenda this evening is the following. We have a 60-minute session with you this evening. We're doing a little bit of housekeeping right now, and then we're going to get into some grounding. Then Professor Han is going to offer her comments. We'll have some time for Q&A, and then we'll move into our closing. A quick word about UUSJ.
Usually it just comes on.
And again, please mute yourselves. For nearly 25 years at UUSJ, we've been building our strength for this fight, even if we didn't know that it was coming during our lifetimes. For more years than UUSJ has existed, our UU faith movement has been grappling with injustice and contending with the pejorative politics in our society. Our denominational history of defying oppression goes even further if we look at the separate histories of both Unitarians and Universalists, our ancestors in spirit. So we know how to do hard things. We're not afraid to meet challenges, and we will do so in somber optimism for our freedoms, our families, and our futures. Love remains our guiding principle and faith value. And UUSJ continues to be a home for those who want to advocate, agitate, and witness to interrupt the interlocking injustices of federal policy violence. We will protect our seemingly fragile democracy, pursue liberty, and we will resist the resurgent American autocracy, oligarchy, plutocracy, and cronyism. We will defy fascistic, vitriolic, and persecutory impulses that have been with us since the early formation as a nation. If that sounds like worthy work to you, please donate to USJ. Your financial support will help fund our defiance. And please buy Professor Han's new book. We are pleased to have her this evening. So with that, I turn over the spotlight to Reverend John Crestwell, Jr. Reverend John will offer tonight's chalice lighting and closing prayer. The Reverend John is a senior minister and executive at the UU Church of Annapolis, Maryland. He's a dynamic leader, minister, and advocate who has been a transformative voice in the UU community for nearly 25 years. He's well known as the co-founder of Awake Ministries, which has redefined worship by blending contemporary music, life coaching, and service to broaden the emotional, racial, and intercultural competencies of his various congregations. He's also an author in his own right, and I encourage you to read his most recent book, You Were Made for So Much More, Interfaith Lessons to Transform Our World. It's a guide to finding purpose and meaning through a broad spiritual lens. And with that, I give you Reverend John.
Good evening, everyone. I see a lot of faces that I know and am familiar with, and I'm so glad you're here. You're in for a treat tonight. Thank you, Pablo, for inviting me to share some grounding work. We need this. We need this talk in this time, and we need each other. Amen. As Unitarian Universalists, we are called to put love at the center and to embody our 6 core values. Jet pig, that's right. Imagine a pig with a jet. That's how you remember our core values. Justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity. And tonight you will hear about these values from a prolific writer, author, and professor, so get ready to be inspired. Dear friends, our faith reminds us that justice cannot exist without equality, and that democracy thrives when all voices are heard and valued. If we want to move toward beloved community, we must continue to believe in a vision where love, justice, and understanding form the foundation of our relationships. We side with love. We side with those who are oppressed and marginalized, those who are unseen or even forgotten. We choose courage over comfort, and we take action that is rooted always in compassion. We must continue to resist oppressive systems. Our values and our principles call us to dismantle these systems as an act of faith, faithful resistance. That's what we do until all souls live in a freer and more equitable world. You're in for a treat, and you're in for some hope at a time when hope is so deeply needed. Before we begin, let us center ourselves, let us pause, reflect, and meditate on these words, grounded in what our faith calls us toward. Spirit of life, spirit of love. We gather in this moment to center our minds and hearts, to listen deeply to the wisdom and insights that challenge us to reflect and inspire us to act with courage, compassion, and clarity. In a world that often feels divided, we embrace the call to wholeness and solidarity. Let us open ourselves to the power of faith that heals, to the truth that unmasks injustice, and to the hope that binds us together as one human family. Bless this space now, bless this conversation, and all who are present. And may our time together be an offering toward the work of love and justice made real, and to a future that holds us all undivided and yet unique, hand in hand. In the spirit of this beloved community, I say amen, ashe, blessed be.
Thank you so much, Reverend John. So this evening, it's my pleasure to introduce Hahrie Han, PhD, who is the inaugural director at the Stavros Nicharos Foundation, Agora Institute, and the Stavros Nicharos Foundation Professor of Political Science and the faculty director at P3 Research Lab at Johns Hopkins. Professor Han has written for outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post and others. She's an award-winning author of 4 books and numerous articles published in leading scholarly outlets, including the American Political Science Review, the American Sociological Review, Nature, Human Behavior, the PNAS, and the Journal of American Medical Association, and elsewhere. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she was named the 2022 Social Innovation Thought Leader of the Year by the Economic Forum's Schwab Foundation. She's also delivered the Tanner Lectures at Harvard University in 2024. And lest you forget her full background, she's also acted as a co-convener of a policy advisory committee for the 2008 Obama campaign. So in her 5th book, Undivided, The Quest for Racial Solidarity in the American Church is about faith and race in America with a focus on megachurches, I believe evangelical megachurches. So why does Professor Han's message matter to UUs? Well, tonight, Professor Han will share her top line observations and reflections from her new book, Undivided, as well as her thoughts on faith, race, and politics after the election. And to be sure, these are all things that UUs care about in a profound and meaningful way. Please buy Professor Han's new book, Undivided, and her previous books. We at UUSJ consider them required reading for the justice fights ahead. It's my hope that Professor Han's comments tonight will whet your appetite and help us understand the implications for our organizing and our mobilizing, our movement building in the season that looms ahead of us. In her body of work, Professor Han describes the nuance and tactics and theoretical foundation for so much of the work that we as Unitarian Universalists want to do as we contribute productively to a pro-democracy movement. So it's my feeling that we should take her comments seriously. We should take the project of organizing our people, our power, and our money seriously. And we should listen carefully for how we can translate UU engagement into political power and motivation to participate in politics. I think these comments tonight will help us understand how to show civic bravery for the inclusive democracy that we as Unitarian Universalists want. And her body of work speaks to all of those goals. So you should buy her book. You should start with Undivided. And now I'll give you the remarkable and compelling Professor Han.
Well, thank you for such a generous introduction. I'm very grateful for the introduction, and thank you, Reverend Crestwell, for opening us tonight. I am really excited to have this opportunity to talk with you all about the book and about the work more broadly. If it's okay, I might share some slides just because it'll help ground the conversation a little bit. Are people seeing the slides? Can someone just give me a thumbs up if it's...
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. As Pavel said, like I wear a couple different hats. I'm a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins. I lead an institute called the SNF Agora Institute. Our mission is trying to realize the promise of the ancient agora in modern times. We believe that the kind of pluralistic spaces where people can gather to learn the capacities of small c, small d democratic citizenship are vital to building the kind of world that we want. And then I also lead a research lab called the P3 Lab. We call it the P3 Lab because we're trying to understand how to make the participation of ordinary people possible, probable, and powerful. So people have to be able to participate, they have to want to participate, and then it has to actually matter. And so a lot of the work that we do is we partner with grassroots movements and entities around the world who are trying to understand, how can they use data and learning to strengthen their practice in terms of pulling people off the sidelines into public life, but then also trying to understand like what the scaffolding is that we need to build around people's participation to make it actually matter, and helping to create the world that we want. But my journey to doing this work was, at least for me, it felt very improbable. I grew up in Texas, in Houston, Texas. I wasn't able to catch like all the places where people were from, so I don't know if there's anyone from Houston on the call, but I grew up in Houston, Texas, where my parents still live. My parents had immigrated from Korea, so I was born in the United States, and lived most of my life in the US. But the experience of being the daughter of immigrants and the granddaughter of refugees from North Korea to South Korea, I think was really pivotal to my experience growing up. And so the picture in the middle is a picture of my family. A lot of what my parents did on summer vacations was to do things like take us to Mount Rushmore, because they thought that's what it meant to be an American family, is that, we go to Mount Rushmore. And so I'm wearing the Mother Goose sweatshirt or the sweater in the middle of that middle picture, because my parents, I think, were really trying. They weren't like, politics was not something we talked about at the dinner table. My parents were not necessarily very politically or civically involved. My dad is still not a citizen. My mom was naturalized when I was in junior high, I think. Um, but what we did talk a lot about is what does it mean to live in this different country, and how do we understand what it means to be American? And that was also true, I think, in the stories that my grandparents passed on to me. My grandparents, moved. This is my dad's family, moved from North Korea to South Korea right before the country was split. But the split sort of happened at a moment when they didn't really expect it. And so my grandfather lost touch with his mother, and he never saw his mother again, after that. And I think that having that experience kind of gave him a really keen sense of what it means to be a pawn in a game that someone else is controlling. And that was a story that was sort of always passed on to us, that being in a game that someone else is controlling means that, things like losing contact with your mother can happen. And so my grandparents were part of the generation that rebuilt South Korea after the war. But I think because of those experiences, we always had a keen sense of how fragile each of those things, like the things that we have, the systems that we build, the societies that we have are. And so I tell you all of this because I didn't find organizing or movements or politics really until I went to college. I did my undergrad at Harvard, and I got, by happenstance, a student organization that I was involved in got into a fight with the university. And so I got involved in student activism because of that, not because I was interested in politics or anything like that. But that activism landed me in a class on community organizing. And I think it's like my brain exploded when I had that, because I think it was the first time that I realized there are people who have an analysis for like all these things that I'd experienced growing up as a child of immigrants, as a non-white kid in a largely white community, just sort of all these different kinds of things. There was someone that had an experience of it out there. But then I think what really spoke to me about organizing and movement building is that at its core, it has this notion of transformation at the center, right? The idea that part of what movements are different, what differentiates organizing or movements from other forms of social change is that they're not trying to sell you products that you already want, but they're trying to transform people so that people can transform the world around them. And I think that notion of transformation, no one ever said the words to me as a kid at the dinner table, but being the child of immigrants meant that I always had a sense that transformation is not only possible, but it's a way of life. right? It's what we do as humans. We try to remake ourselves, to remake our families, to remake the world around us. And so that's what really drew me into organizing. And so a lot of the work that I do is really trying to understand how do we understand the kind of like practices of transformation that are at the heart, I think, of what really is necessary. And so one way to think about it is like a lot of, what I try to do is like use the resources of the university and scholarship to kind of understand the mechanics of transformation itself. And so, thinking about that, that's sort of the lens with which I kind of come into this political moment. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about in this particular moment that we're in, especially post-election, is what I might think of as kind of like a mismatch between supply and demand. And what I mean by that is, if we look, like there's a way in which, if we look at the kind of like series of pattern of elections that we've had in the US in the 21st century, one of the things that stands out is that we're in a period of what political scientists might call unstable majorities, right? So that it's historically unusual for us to see this kind of flip-flopping back and forth between partisan control of our federal institutions, right? And that historically in the past, what has happened is that usually one party will kind of capture the public imagination for some period of time and then retain control of our political institutions, even in polarized periods, so that they can enact a kind of policy agenda. And so if we think, for example, in the New Deal period, there's this moment of crisis. And then basically what ended up happening is that the Democrats and FDR, were able to articulate a vision for a different kind of society that captured a stable majority of the public, right? And so they were able to kind of win and retain control of our national institutions in order to like enact and remake the role of federal government in society through the New Deal. And I don't know if anyone's ever heard of a guy named Wendell Willkie, but Wendell Willkie was a candidate that the Republicans ran for president 4 times during that period, so it took them running the same candidate 4 times before they realized, gosh, like the Democrats really have it, they really have this period of this stable majority. And that's what we don't have right now, right? Where, even when like Obama won unified control of the House and the Senate and the presidency, in the next midterm election, he lost that, control of Congress. And, you sort of see that flip-flopping back and forth, even as one party kind of retains the presidency. And so the expectation is that even though the Republicans won unified control of Congress and the presidency in this particular election, that the null expectation is that the next midterm we'll see a reversion back in Congress. And I think what that the one way to interpret that, or the way that I'm understanding that, or that I've been thinking about a lot since the election, is that neither political party has captured the imagination of the public or articulated a vision that speaks to what people really are hungry for right now, And so what we're seeing is this constant flip-flopping back and forth where, because neither party is able to kind of articulate and capture that stable vision, that you see kind of people sort of switching, like, well, maybe this choice is better, maybe that choice is better, maybe this is better, we see that kind of like flip-flopping back and forth. And to me, that mismatch between supply and demand speaks not only to a pattern that we see in partisan control, but I think also a pattern that we see in our political system more broadly, which in some ways reminds me of the stories that my grandfather used to tell, where there's been a separation in the past few decades between the people who are like the subjects and the objects of our political system. And increasingly, what we're starting to see is a divide between people who feel like they are the pawns in the game that other people are controlling, and other people who are trying to control the game itself. And the reaction that we're seeing among people who feel like they are the objects of someone else's control is that sometimes when the game doesn't go their way, they want to blow up the whole game, right? Or they want to withdraw from the game itself. There's an old African proverb, which I'm going to, I'm sure I'm going to like butcher it, but it's something to the effect of, the child who doesn't feel embraced by the village will set it on fire in order to feel its warmth, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's like, people who feel like they're not being embraced by the kind of political and economic systems that we have are going to set it on fire just to feel its warmth in a way. And so I sort of offer that framing as a way of saying that part of what I think is both a challenge and the opportunity in this moment then is that the challenge is stark, right? The opportunity is that if there is that the opportunity, I think, is that people are hungry for something out there, and I think that people are hungry for something that feels authentic, that makes them feel like they can be architects of their own future. And the challenge really is, how do we create the kind of supply of opportunities that people need to be able to put their hands on the levers of change, to feel like they can be authors of their own future, that they're not the objects of someone else's game. And part of what brought me to this project, Undivided, which is the book that I have worked on most recently, is I think faith institutions have a really important role to play in that, because faith institutions are one of the few institutions left in which I think they offer people a real broad swath of lots of different kinds of people that opportunity. And so what this book does is it tells the story it traces the story of four characters like they're real people, four people who are organizing around racial justice within the third largest evangelical megachurch in America. So it's a non-denominational Protestant megachurch that is called the Crossroads Church. It's located in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's now a 35,000 person church. So they get about 35,000 people who show up in person every week and about 500,000 people that tune in online. So this is a church that has a scale that is like rivaled by few institutions in America. There are few institutions in America that can bring that many people together at any given time. It's a white dominant church. It's about 80% white, 20% non-white. And in 2015, there was a Black pastor who spoke out about his need to his calling to work on issues of racial justice within his community in Cincinnati, and he preached that from the main stage one Sunday, expecting that, not knowing what would happen, and there was an outpouring of support from the community where people said, look, I don't know what you're going to do, but if you're going to do something, I want to be a part of it. And so then he realized, well, now I've got to do something, And so what he ended up doing is building this program called Undivided. And so what the book does is the first half of the book traces the stories of four people who go through Undivided. And I call that first half agitation. It's about how do they become agitated to begin to do all this work on anti-racism. It's in the characters, it's a Black woman, a Black man, a white woman, and a white man. And then the second half of the book is called Backlash. And it's really about, as they begin to carry out the work of anti-racism in their lives, they each experience backlash in different ways from their church, from their workplaces, from their families. And how do they navigate that backlash? And the book sort of tells those stories. It's very grounded in narrative. And I'll just sort of say, it was named, for people who might have read some of my other work, which has been much more academic, this book is written in a way that's trying to be accessible to a much broader audience. So I was really gratified and really honored that it was named on the New York Times, like one of the 100 notable books of the year and stuff like that. And I offer that not to toot my own horn, but just to sort of really give you evidence that it actually is readable, I think. And so it's meant for a broad audience in that way. But what I wanted to do with the rest of my time is just kind of offer a couple thoughts, I think, that lessons that kind of come out of if we were to generalize away from the stories in the book, like what are some of the key lessons that come at that, and how does that speak to this moment of supply and demand, that I was just arguing about. So let me just offer a few thoughts and then I'll stop. So I want to, in offering those thoughts, I just want to frame that, like, I know a lot of people, think about, when I sort of say, like, I'm doing this story about people who are organizing around racial justice within a, white Christian, within a evangelical megachurch, the first thing people think of is white Christian nationalism, right? Because if you, like me, I did not grow up in an evangelical tradition, only read the New York Times about white evangelicals, then you probably have heard about things like, 8 or 9 white evangelicals voted for Trump, that it feels like these churches are just like cauldrons of white Christian nationalism and MAGA. And I think what I was surprised to find is how much heterogeneity there actually is. And I have a lot of thoughts on why that is and why there's more heterogeneity than what the data might show. But what I want to focus on here is that one of the things that's really interesting is that if you only listen to the stories about the way Christianity and faith is often covered in the news, it seems like so many Christian churches are moving in this direction of white Christian nationalism. But if you listen to the conservative news, a lot of what they say is that that actually it's the liberal churches that are the problem. It's the liberal churches that are engaging in all this political activity and trying to exert their will over the political sphere. And so, what is actually true? And if you look at the actual data, one of the things that's really interesting is that it's actually white liberal Christians whose political activity outstrips the political activity of any of other religious groups. So white liberal Christians are more politically active if we just look at the number of political activities that they do than white conservative Christians, or moderate Christians. This graph just look at the same data but breaks it out by race. They're more politically active than Black Christians. And so a lot of the kind of common narratives that we have about who is active are really different. But what's interesting is that even though it is true that the actual number of political acts that most white liberal Christians engage in exceeds the number of political acts that conservative Christians are engaged in, conservative Christians exert a much more powerful kind of force in politics. And so why is that? And I think part of that has to do with the ways in which it's organized, and so I think there's an organizing story to be told here. And so, when I began to dive into the work on Undivided, one of the things that I didn't know is that the Crossroads Church is part of a trend of megachurches in America that are really growing, and so a megachurch is defined as a church that has 2,000 or more members. Church attendance has become so skewed towards megachurches that the top 9% of churches in America contain 50% of the church-going population, right? So like half of the church-going population attends one of these large churches, and the average megachurch has grown over the last period that we have data, which is 2015 to 2020. The last megachurch grew by about 30%, and people are contributing in major ways to these churches, right? So the average megachurch has a budget of about $5.3 million a year, and it's 96% funded by individual donations. Crossroads, which is the third largest megachurch in America, their annual budget is something like $65 million a year. So they're just operating at this enormous scale. And I offer you this. This is part of to sort of say like, well, if you buy my argument that there's this mismatch between supply and demand, right? There's this mismatch between what people are hungry for and what our political system is offering, then one of the questions to ask is, well, where are people going, right? If they're not going to the parties, if they're not going to politics, like where are they going? And it turns out one of the places they're going are megachurches, and we could have a whole separate conversation, I think, about from a theological perspective, what does it mean for people's spiritual growth to be in a megachurch? And I think that's a separate conversation. But as a political scientist, like one of the things that I feel like I had to understand was like, well, putting normative questions of whether or not you think it's good or bad, the fact is it is a reality for so many people, and these churches are touching so many people's lives. And part of what I want to understand is like, what is it that is drawing people into these churches in a way that we see a lot of other civic institutions kind of losing people. And I think one of the things that I really learned from this experience is that these churches are extraordinary at offering people opportunities to develop their own agency. And I think that is something that is really different from a lot of the political organizations that I work with. So in the P3 lab and other work that I do, like we partner with a lot of racial and economic justice organizations, environmental organizations, like other kind of groups that are trying to draw people into the work of justice. And it wasn't until I spent 7 years researching Undivided and Crossroads that I began to understand how different the kind of invitations that people are offered in Crossroads are relative to the kind of invitations that they're offered in some of these other kind of political organizations that I've worked with. And so the way to kind of differentiate that is if you imagine that in any kind of invitation that I offer somebody, then let's imagine that you could sort of map it out on a two-dimensional space where one dimension is the nature of the social environment, right? So am I inviting people into activities and actions where they can do the action by themselves, where they work alone, right? Or am I inviting them into actions where they are placed into a community of belonging, right? Of connectedness, of commitment, and social connection, right? And then the other dimension is essentially if you imagine that the horizontal dimension is like a social dimension, the vertical dimension is like a learning dimension, right? Am I inviting people and offering them opportunities where they're invited to take strategic risks, right? Where they're invited to strategize solutions on their own? Or am I inviting people into opportunities where they're not asked to take any risk or develop any strategy on their own? And what I would offer is that I think the vast majority of our political space or our civic space is in that bottom left-hand quadrant, right? Where people are asked to do things that are isolated and individualistic, and they outsource strategy to professionals, usually professional paid staff. So I'm asked to donate money, put my name on a petition, like social media posts, even show up to a march, vote, right? These are all things where I'm asked to, as Reverend Michael McBride, who some of you might know, who says is that people are essentially like ATMs for ballots, bucks, and bodies. That like I give money, I give my vote, or I show up to a thing, right? But I'm basically I'm an interchangeable cog in a machine. I'm the object of someone else's game, right? And that's because I'm never invited to offer my own solutions. Instead, it sort of is like, you sign a petition, give me the money, but then let the professionals decide what we're going to do with that petition. Let the professionals decide what we're going to, who the candidate's going to be, or like all this kind of stuff. And so what ends up happening is that people over time begin to realize, like, I'm just outsourcing all the solutions to other people, and they're not solving the problems in my life. Like turns out that like life is getting rough for all of us, in really material ways. And so I think people's anger is beginning to come out in different ways. And what I began to understand that Crossroads and Undivided were doing really differently is they were inviting people into a space of deep belonging, right? And they invited people to strategize their own solutions. And so people were in that top right-hand quadrant. And part of that, meant that there was a lot more risk that they had to take, so Crossroads has a lot of, they have a strong culture of risk. And so one of the things they always say is we have a big back door, right? And so the invitation is always like, look, if you feel uncomfortable, then you are free to leave, right? And they say that actually they want people to stay, but the idea is that like if you don't feel uncomfortable sometimes when you're here, that means you're not growing, And so we're inviting you into a space where we're going to challenge you, and that's part of what it means to be part of a faith community. They have another saying where they'll say belonging comes before belief, right? And the idea is that no matter who you are, whether you're an atheist, whether you're a Christian, whether you are, our brand of Christian or not, like you are a part of our community, like you belong to us. And they have a culture of radical welcome and radical hospitality so that, it's like if you ever go to a Crossroads experience, it feels really warm. It's like you're embraced by, and somehow in 35,000 person church, it feels really socially warm, And the idea is that like, look, they're not trying to hide who they are. So they're really clear about like, look, we're an evangelical megachurch. We're going to try to evangelize you, but the idea is belonging comes first and belief comes second, A lot of our political organizations implicitly, I think, have the opposite stance where it sort of is like belief comes before belonging, right? So first you have to demonstrate that you are with us, and then we'll invite you into our community of belonging. And I think that happens in both formal and informal ways. And so, recently I did a book talk at in a progressive space in Philadelphia, and I remember someone, very well-meaning, came up to me and was like, "Oh, how'd you get to Philadelphia?" And I said, "Oh, I took the train from Baltimore." And they were like, "Oh, you took the train? Well, how did you offset your carbon?" And of course, I hadn't, I'm not of course, but like I had not offset my carbon, but immediately by having that question asked, it made me feel like, oh, like I wasn't good enough to be in this space, And so it's sort of like things like that, where it's like implicit, both formally and informally, there are ways in which we put belief before belonging. And so, anyways, it's just sort of, I think that like one of the things that I really think of, that I've been thinking a lot about is like, I think one of the things that people are hungry for in politics, in our politics, is a space where they feel like they can be authors of their own future and they have a sphere of influence over which they can put their hands on the levers of change. And the mismatch between supply and demand that we're seeing is that so much of the supply is run by professionals who aren't willing to give up that control and take that kind of risk, which is the opposite of what I saw in Undivided when they were trying to invite people in a space of anti-racism. They were inviting people to develop their own solutions, which meant that sometimes people developed not good solutions, and they had to navigate their way through that. But it was by having these kind of like relationships and these like feedback loops where people could realize, oh, I thought I was going to do X, but actually I'm getting all this feedback that's like not appropriate at all. So I need to like readjust. But instead of having someone spoon feed them a solution, people kind of learn that by themselves, that by the end, they own the solutions, they own the results of the change, And so it had a stickiness that was really different than other things that I've seen. Let me say one more thing. I know I'm a little bit over time. I'm gonna skip this. Is that the other piece I think that was really important that I learned in Crossroads and Undivided is just the importance of structure, which is that in order for people to develop their agency, they needed to have a human scaled space where people could practice and learn, where they could get on the bike and fall off and get back on the bike, right? And I can't do that in the context of 35,000 people, let alone 100 people, right? It's like in order to kind of navigate and develop my own internal compass around what does it mean for me to live a life of anti-racism, like I have to have a manageable number of relationships with whom I am navigating the complexity of that question, right? But if I only am doing that in my small group of 10 or 15 people, then it starts to feel precious over time, right? And so because Undivided was happening in the context of this huge megachurch, the work that people were doing felt small and big at the same time. And holding that tension between small and big, I think was really powerful because it gave people a human scaled experience and a way to rehearse a different way of being that was countercultural to all the pressures of racial privilege in our society, right? But at the same time, it made people feel like they were part of something bigger than themselves, right? So the work that they were doing was scaling in a different way. And both of those things were really necessary for making that work have meaning. And so the structure, that the image that I've been thinking about in my head is that they essentially created like a honeycomb structure where if you imagine like a beehive, there are all these little cells, and then each of those cells are connected to each other. And that's what makes the honeycomb strong, right? Is that cellular structure. And what I saw in Crossroads is like the book kind of follows this people who are organizing around racial justice from about 2015 to 2023, like pretty tumultuous time in American politics. And what that cellular structure enabled Undivided Crossroads to do is bend without breaking under all the pressures and the controversy and the tension that they were absolutely not immune to, but they were able to bend without breaking because of this kind of cellular structure. And so I just have on the slide, Dave Ferguson is an evangelical pastor who I've gotten to know through this work, who leads one of the largest like church growth networks in the United States. And he sort of says, gosh, that if you look at that Jesus is the original organizer, right? And if you look in the Bible, that like, everyone thinks of Jesus as like Sermon on the Mount, big miracles in front of like crowds of thousands of people. But actually, Jesus spent 73% of his total time with the 12 apostles, that like what he was doing was he was investing in this like small group. And so that was the secret to scale. Right? The secret to scale and to growth for the church was not the Sermon on the Mount, right? It was the ability of Jesus to invest in this group of 12 who could then go on and multiply in certain ways. And so when he's working with other church leaders, one of the questions he asks them all the time is, what is the smallest reproducible unit in your church? right? And how are you investing in that? And that to me is the same idea as the honeycomb, is like the smallest reproducible unit, in this case, in Crossroads, was these small groups. And by investing in those, people had that human scaled space where they could rehearse a different way of being. And then that space could then be multiplied into bigger structural change because of the way that it was laddered together in this honeycomb. So anyways, those are just a couple of the lessons. I'm sorry that took a lot longer than I intended, and so I apologize for that. But I will stop my slides and would love to open it up for discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Han. And I just want to go on record and say, before I joined USJ, I worked plenty of campaigns, and I, on many occasions, did I get myself in trouble by referring to Jesus as a super or arch organizer. So, so that comment strikes me as particularly funny. People are asking if you can give us a couple of examples of what Crossroad does programmatically to make these conceptual approaches real in the space of the church. They're very curious to know the implementation side of this story. Obviously, one thing that everybody can do is go and buy Professor Han's new book, and it'll take you through a couple of different scenarios. But perhaps you could try to answer the question.
Yes. So two things I would say. First, so I grew up in the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church has it's very hierarchical church. There's all this doctrine and rules and like that kind of stuff. And so one of the things that really surprised me about evangelicalism when I began to do this work is that, there's no central authority that sort of says like, this is what all churches must do or anything like that. And so these mega churches that are operating at this big scale, like they all have their own ways of articulating that this is what we stand for, And so Crossroads has this kind of idea of like these 7 hills that we die on, which are just like a certain set of core principles that they just say all the time. And so it's like infused into the culture of the church. And so when people first join, they're invited into this like, well, you should join like our welcome group. And then like they learn these 7 principles, and the clergy say them from the main stage all the time. That it's just sort of like it's in the water, in Crossroads. And so a lot of the ideas like belonging comes before belief, the idea like we do life together, that like if you think that, your transformation, your relationship with Jesus is going to happen by showing up to services on an hour a week on a Sunday, then you're wrong. Like we do life together. That's what it means to be in community with each other, the idea like of, I can't remember exactly what the language is, but something about like, there's something about risk taking, that's sort of embedded in those 7 principles. There's also stuff like, we believe the Bible is literal, like all these kind of stuff, right? And so there's a cultural kind of like understanding that they shape very explicitly through the words that they say and stuff like that. But then in terms of the practice, I think like Undivided is a good example of that. Like Undivided, if I just told you what the curriculum was like, it's very similar to a lot of DEI programs that probably a lot of us, certainly I have had to do like in my workplace. That's not what was unique about Undivided. But usually what happens in those DEI curriculum, they say, okay, we're going to teach you about implicit racism now, because you know what implicit racism is, and we all have some sort of, implicit racism in our hearts. Here's how you should behave when you're confronted with these different kind of situations. And instead of doing that, Undivided would say, we're going to invite you into a space of vulnerability. We want you to develop relationships with people who are of the same race and of the opposite race of you. We want you to reflect on what your experience of race was. And then now that you've learned about implicit racism or structural injustice or whatever the different like lessons were, then how should you react in these different kind of situations? And so they would invite people to kind of develop their own solutions. The small group structure is very common in megachurches. Small groups are self-governing entities that can be organized around everything from a Bible study to to like people who want to go bowling on Fridays, on the West Side or something like that, And so there are these kind of self-governing groups that essentially teach the habits of small d democracy to people. And so I think there's different things like that where people essentially are invited to architect their own spaces in a way that's different from a lot of other spaces I've seen.
Thank you so much for that. And I'll just say here, if you like that sort of small group fellowship and want to build power and build community, USJ's action teams are small groups where you can do exactly that kind of fellowship. So consider joining USJ's action teams. I put a link in the chat. One of the questions we have in the chat is, Professor Han, can you talk some about how this latest book connects to all your rich and wonderful prior research on community organizing strategies and effectiveness? And I'll share here. When I saw you speak, I was just blown away about the reality among UUs that in point of fact, belonging comes before belief. We may not have branded it that way, but we have been living some version of that for a while, at least in all the UU spaces that I cherish.
Yeah, I think of a lot of the work that I've done. So most of my previous books have basically been about organizing and the mechanics of organizing. So I have one that looked at the sort of 2008, 2012 Obama campaigns and how they were able to build a movement at scale. I have another book that looks at what kind of organizations are most effective at getting people involved. And then another book, Prisms, that looks at which ones are most effective at translating people's engagement into actual political influence. But in all of those, I think the theme that unifies them is I'm trying to like open up the black box of organizing. And I think if every now and then when I have this like existential crisis, like, does anything I do ever matter in the world? I sort of think like if the one message I hope that people take from my work is that not all forms of collective action are the same. Like just getting people to take action is not the same as so there's a difference between getting people to do a thing and getting people to become the kind of people who do what needs to be done, right? And so much of our political system is oriented around getting people to do a thing, right? That's very different from asking people to become the kind of people who develop the internal compass they need to navigate a complex, unjust world, And how do we get people to become the kind of people who do what needs to be done? And so a lot of my work is trying to open up the black box of those processes so that we can become more strategic and intentional about them. And I think that even if Undivided was not using the language of organizing necessarily, like essentially what they were doing was organizing, around an anti-racist sort of racial justice agenda. And they were doing it within the context of a church that is very oriented around this like missionary spirit, which also, as I dove into the history of like missionary traditions in Christianity, a lot of that also has like a lot of resonance with some of the practices of organizing. And so I originally started the project because it was so unusual to me to see a Protestant evangelical megachurch that was operating at such scale and doing this work around racial justice. What drew me into the project was there was a 2016 ballot initiative in Cincinnati where Undivided volunteers played a huge role in passing a very progressive, racially just initiative for universal preschool. And the fact that they were able to do that in the 2016 election when Trump won Ohio, Trump won the presidency that year, there was such a sort of like mismatch between those outcomes that I wanted to understand what made that possible. But as I dug into it, I realized that it was very resonant with all the questions I've been asking about how it is that we engage people in ways that enable them to become authors of their own future, and particularly in moments of like deep divisiveness, how do we do it in a way that really embraces the pluralism of a complex community?
I guess that raises for me, I guess, what's probably going to be one of our last questions. Professor Han, your book is inspiring and it brings optimism to my mind, my brain, precisely because it suggests that there are, in fact, places and spaces within our political landscape that we might be able to find some common ground with uncommon allies. So I'd invite you to think and share with us again, what do you think your book, the research that you've done, implies about how we can partner with folks that are not visible in the media to really advocate for the kind of multiracial inclusive democracy that so many Unitarian Universalists care about? Is there some kernel of, is there a mustard seed of hope in the story of Undivided that we can apply to our organizing and our work?
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think to me, it's, hope is about finding, is like about finding these little pinpricks of light, in what sometimes feels like a dark moment, and then figuring out like, how do we make those pinpricks, which are just sort of like, little nuggets of possibility. How do we turn the possible into the probable? Right? How do we, and that's one of the things I really hope that by telling the narrative, it's like it's not just like a random accident that this happened, but that we can begin to make meaning of it so that we can become intentional about it in other spaces. So certainly that's one thing is I don't think the lessons from Undivided are ones where it's like, well, this is only possible in this one place and it's called Crossroads. I think there are lessons that can be carried through all different kinds of organizations, especially other faith institutions. The second thing that I would say is that to me, like, a lot of the world that I live in is very much trying to understand, like, how do we strengthen democracy, not only in the US, but all over the world. And I always kind of come back to this question of like, what is this thing that we're trying to do when it comes to democracy? And to me, democracy is most fundamentally at its core about this question of how do we forge a common life together? And that's a hard thing to do. For anyone who's been in a family or like a long-term relationship, like forging a common life together is hard when there's just four of us, like me and my husband and my two kids. Like there's a lot of negotiation, there's a lot of compromise, there's just like a lot of things that go into it, And it's harder the bigger the community gets. It's also harder the more pluralistic the community gets. Yet it's so vital, right? And I think one of the things that we've forgotten in a way because our, and this is a little bit, I think, the man argument is that because our politics has become such a, so grounded in this like world of spectacle where people feel like they're not actual subjects in it, you know, that we've forgotten all the skills that we need to forge a common life with our family are the same skills that we need to forge a common life with our neighbors, you know, but how often are we invited into and given opportunities to do that kind of negotiation, right? To create the kind of commitments that it takes. Like sometimes, I mean, I love my husband. We've been married for over 20 years, but he drives me crazy sometimes, And so it's like, but like, when we fight like we want to stay married because we do, And so it's like, where are we given the opportunities to do that kind of work in our civic lives? And I think it's all too rare, but it's not a hard thing to offer. And so I guess like for me, as I think about, the faith institutions that you all are a part of, that you all lead, the kind of work of other denominations, around the country, I think one of the things I've really come away with from this project is just a renewed appreciation and understanding of how important such institutions are, because those are the spaces that offer those kinds of opportunities for commitment, for belonging, for learning to navigate, this question of how we forge a common life together.
Okay, and then I promise this is the final question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My answers are so long. I'm so sorry. Part of the problem is me.
No, not at all. But many people would just are asking me to ask you, what can you do to best advance racial justice based on your work with Crossroads? What do you think we should be focused on? Is it building those relationships, building those human scale interactions?
Here's what I would say, and this is I'm saying this partly not to sort of, I think building those relationships, like all this kind of stuff that we're talking about is really important. My gut is, and this is just based on the people I know who are part of Unitarian communities, is like that's already in the DNA of a lot of Unitarian people that I know and a lot of Unitarian communities. I think what I would say that maybe isn't like quite as instinctive in the DNA is like invest in strengthening the civic infrastructure that we need to reach people who aren't instinctively easy to reach, you know? And what I mean by that is the work that we're talking about, it's easiest to do with the people who are already volunteering to show up. And not to say that that's easy, you know, like that's hard. I don't mean to minimize that. But what we know from the data is that it's like the people who are offering themselves and showing up are just such a small population, part of the American public. And I think the people that we need to reach are the people who feel like, I'm not a joiner. I don't go to those kinds of things, you know, yet they are, what we do know is like they're part of soccer leagues, they're part of neighborhood associations, they're part of like all these other kinds of spaces that it's just they're part of workplaces, you know, that are hard to avoid as you move through the world. And so I think part of the question is, what role can we all play in strengthening the infrastructure of institutions that we need and connecting them to each other to reach not only that first layer, but also that next layer of people.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Han. It was a pleasure to hear your comments this evening. And with that, I'm just going to ask the audience one more time. If you think the work that UUSJ does is important and needed, please consider a donation. Please buy Professor Han's book, Undivided. I've put the link in the chat, but there are also some great recommendations that you should request your local bookseller purchase it and bring it to you at your doorstep. And with that, I turn the spotlight back to Reverend John, and I say thank you so much, Professor Han. We deeply appreciate your wisdom and insight.
You have given us a lot to think about. Thank you so much. As we leave the space tonight, we pause now for a moment. May we carry with us the wisdom shared, the hope, the call for unity that Professor Han has inspired in us. May we remember that belonging comes before belief, that we learn to embrace more and erase less. May we move forward in our commitment to racial justice and democracy for all. May our work for the beloved community continue, the beloved community. And may our commitment to justice be guided by compassion. We are one cell in the body of 8 billion cells. The body is humankind. Might we continue to invest in that honeycomb of humanity, finding better and more inclusive ways to draw the circle wider. And so in this spirit, go forth, empowered, inspired, and challenged to build a more perfect union within ourselves and society at large. In the name of all that is holy and good, I leave these words. May it be so, and amen.
Thank you so much, Reverend John. So
we
now,
want more. We want more. We want
yes,
more.
I know. We want more. And so many people are asking, how can we bring Professor Han either to General Assembly in June or to their local church in some way? And I encourage you to reach out to her. At UUSJ, much like your services, we do this informal soft close. Guests, you're invited to go about your business and enjoy the rest of your evening. Anybody else who has something to do, please do that. But for those of you who like to process a little bit in community, I'm going to hold space here. I'm going to linger. I'm going to answer questions, and we're going to jawbone a little bit. But please,